He kept talking about marriage but never took the step, so I finally walked away. It wasn't a sudden decision, nor was it born out of anger or resentment in a single moment. Instead, it was a slow unraveling of hope and patience, a gradual recognition that the promises made were merely words drifting into the air, never taking root in reality. I remember the early days, when every mention of marriage felt like a warm embrace, a promise of a future built together. Those moments filled me with excitement and dreams that stretched far beyond what we could see. But as time wore on, those dreams began to feel like mirages, beautiful from afar but impossible to reach. In the beginning, he was everything I thought I wanted in a partner. Kind, attentive, and full of plans that included me in every step. We would talk about life together, about the places we'd live, the family we might raise, the adventures we would share. Marriage was always a topic that came up naturally, not as a pressure but as a shared vision. It felt like a mutual understanding, a silent agreement that this was what we were moving toward. I was young and hopeful, eager to build a life with someone who seemed just as committed as I was. Yet, as months turned into years, the language began to shift. The promises remained, but the actions didn't follow. He spoke of marriage in vague terms, always someday but never now. There were never any concrete plans, no ring, no proposal, no serious conversations about timelines or commitments. Instead, it felt like an endless loop of reassurances that nothing had changed, that our future was still bright, but always just out of reach. I started to question myself, wondering if I was asking for too much or being unreasonable in expecting him to take that step. I tried to be patient. I convinced myself that love wasn't about rushing into marriage but about building a strong foundation. I told myself that maybe he had fears, maybe he needed more time. I held on to the hope that one day he would surprise me, that he would finally make the commitment I longed for. But with each passing year, my hope began to fade, replaced by a creeping doubt that settled deep in my chest. I watched other couples around me move forward with their lives, celebrating engagements and weddings, while I remained stuck in the same place, waiting for a promise that never came true. The more I waited, the more I noticed the cracks forming between us. Our conversations about the future became strained, filled with uncertainty and avoidance. When I brought up the subject, he would deflect or reassure me with empty words that meant nothing. I felt invisible, like my desires and dreams were being dismissed without a second thought. It was as if he was content to keep things as they were, comfortable in the status quo, while I was desperate for growth and change. I started to feel resentment creeping in, bitter and sharp. I resented the way he could talk about forever without ever committing to it. I resented myself for hoping and waiting for something that seemed increasingly unlikely. I resented the silence that grew between us, the distance that wasn't physical but emotional, a gulf that widened with each passing day. It was a slow suffocation, the kind that doesn't announce itself with loud noise but creeps in quietly until you realize you can barely breathe. At some point, I began to question what love really meant. Was it enough to be with someone who promised everything but gave nothing? Was love just words, or was it action? I realized that love required more than empty promises. It needed effort, commitment, and courage to take risks. I realized that waiting for him to take the step was costing me my own happiness, my own sense of worth. I was sacrificing my dreams and my future on the altar of hope, clinging to the idea of us instead of facing the reality of what we had become. The decision to walk away was not easy. It was the hardest choice I ever made, filled with grief and fear. I mourned the future that would never be, the life we had planned but never lived. I mourned the love I thought we shared, the man I thought he was. But I also felt a strange sense of liberation, a reclaiming of myself that I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, I was choosing me, my happiness, my future. Walking away meant facing the unknown, stepping into a world without the safety net of a relationship that had defined me for so long. It meant learning to be alone, to find strength in solitude. It meant rebuilding my self-esteem and my dreams from the ground up. But it also meant freedom, the freedom to find someone who would match my commitment, who would not just talk about marriage but live it with me. It meant opening the door to possibilities I had closed off in my heart. In the months and years that followed, I learned to love myself in ways I never had before. I discovered that my worth was not tied to someone else's promises, that I was whole and complete on my own. I surrounded myself with people who supported me and believed in me. I pursued my passions and goals without hesitation. And slowly, the pain of walking away transformed into strength and hope. Looking back, I don't regret my decision. I am grateful for the lessons I learned, for the courage I found within myself to say no to a future that wasn't meant for me. I know now that love is not about waiting for someone else to make you whole, it's about finding someone who complements your wholeness and walks beside you with equal devotion. And if he had truly wanted to marry me, he would have taken that step. But he didn't. And that was his choice, not mine. I walked away because I deserved more than words. I walked away because I believed in my own worth. And in walking away, I found the freedom to create a life filled with real love, real commitment, and real happiness. After I walked away, the initial days were a confusing mixture of relief and sorrow. It was as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, yet my heart felt fragile and raw. I spent a lot of time alone, reflecting on what had happened and why I had allowed myself to stay in a limbo for so long. I realized that much of my hesitation had come from fear, not fear of losing him, but fear of being alone, fear of stepping into uncertainty without a clear roadmap. I had convinced myself that being with him, even without the commitment I craved, was better than being alone. But in truth, that fear had been chaining me down, keeping me in a place that wasn't healthy or fulfilling. In that solitude, I began to explore parts of myself that had been dormant for years. I reconnected with old hobbies and interests I had put aside. I traveled to places I had always wanted to visit but never did because I was waiting for the right time. Suddenly, those opportunities were mine, unrestricted by anyone else's indecision. I started journaling, pouring out my thoughts and emotions onto paper, giving voice to feelings I had long suppressed. Writing became a form of therapy, a way to understand my own heart and mind without judgment or expectation. I also sought support from friends and family, those who had quietly witnessed my struggle and never stopped encouraging me to value myself. Their words, their presence, reminded me that I was not alone, that I was deserving of love that was steady and real, not conditional or elusive. I learned to ask for help when I needed it, to express my needs clearly and without shame. This was a new kind of strength, one that came from vulnerability and honesty. Over time, I noticed a shift in how I viewed relationships. What once seemed like a desperate need for validation became a desire for partnership rooted in mutual respect and genuine connection. I no longer felt the urge to rush or settle. I understood that the right person would come into my life naturally, someone who wouldn't just talk about marriage but would show it through actions. Someone who would value my dreams as much as his own, who would see me as an equal partner in building a shared future. Looking back at my previous relationship, I saw it with new clarity. It wasn't that he didn't love me, but his love was incomplete. It lacked the courage to commit fully, the willingness to take responsibility for our shared future. I realized that love is not simply about feelings or words but about choosing each other every day, through actions big and small. It's about showing up, even when it's hard, and being present in both the good times and the challenges. I also came to understand that some people are not ready for what you want, and that's not necessarily anyone's fault. Sometimes, timing doesn't align, or priorities differ. But staying in a relationship where one person's needs are consistently met is a disservice to both parties. It's a slow erosion of self-esteem and trust. Walking away was an act of self-respect, a declaration that my happiness mattered just as much as anyone else's. As the years passed, I embraced this new chapter with an open heart. I continued to grow, to learn, and to heal. I met new people, some who came and went, others who left a lasting impression. With each experience, I gained wisdom about what I truly wanted and needed. I learned to trust my instincts and to listen to my inner voice, which guided me away from relationships that didn't serve me and toward those that nourished my soul. Eventually, love found me again, but this time it was different. It wasn't rushed or pressured, it was steady and real. He didn't just talk about marriage, he showed me every day what it meant to be committed. He was patient, kind, and honest. And when he proposed, it wasn't because I had waited so long or pushed him, but because he was ready and wanted to share his life with me fully. That moment was not the culmination of years of uncertainty but the natural progression of a relationship built on mutual trust and respect. I often think about the woman I was back then, the one who waited and hoped against hope. I wish I could tell her that it's okay to walk away, that choosing yourself is not selfish but necessary. I would tell her that love doesn't have to be painful or confusing, that it can be clear and beautiful if you're willing to wait for the right person who will match your commitment. Most importantly, I would remind her that she is enough just as she is, and she deserves a love that lifts her up instead of holding her back. My journey taught me that sometimes the hardest choices lead to the greatest freedom. Walking away was not the end of my story but the beginning of a new one filled with hope, growth, and genuine love. And in that, I found the happiness I had been searching for all along. Even after I had found a new relationship grounded in real commitment, the echoes of the past lingered in unexpected ways. Sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet and my thoughts took over, I would catch myself revisiting those years of waiting and wondering. I grappled with the complex emotions of regret and relief tangled together, trying to understand how I had stayed so long in a place that no longer served me. It wasn't easy to reconcile the love I once felt with the disappointment that ultimately pushed me away. But those reflections also helped me appreciate how much I had grown. I realized that patience can be a virtue, but only to a point. There's a fine line between giving someone space to grow and losing yourself in the process. I had crossed that line without even realizing it, sacrificing my own happiness for the comfort of a familiar presence. That lesson was invaluable. It taught me to honor my feelings and set boundaries, to know when to hold on and when to let go. I also came to understand that walking away doesn't mean failure. Society often frames ending a relationship as a defeat, but in truth, it's an act of courage and self-awareness. It's a declaration that you value your own life enough to pursue something better, even if that means facing uncertainty. I was proud of myself for choosing that path, for refusing to settle for less than I deserved. The process of healing after walking away was gradual. I had to confront feelings of loneliness and fear, the doubt that crept in during moments of vulnerability. But instead of trying to ignore those feelings or suppress them, I learned to sit with them, to acknowledge their presence without letting them control me. I practiced self-compassion, reminding myself that healing is not linear and that it's okay to have setbacks. Through therapy and self-reflection, I worked on rebuilding my sense of identity outside of a relationship. I discovered that my worth wasn't defined by whether someone chose to marry me or not, but by who I was as an individual. I embraced my strengths and accepted my imperfections. I began to see myself as a whole person, deserving of love and happiness regardless of my relationship status. As I moved forward, I became more mindful in my relationships. I paid closer attention to red flags and nonverbal cues. I learned to communicate openly about my needs and expectations from the beginning, instead of hoping they would be understood implicitly. This newfound clarity empowered me to build healthier connections, where both partners were equally invested in the future. Looking back, I realized that his failure to propose was not just about fear or indecision, it was a reflection of who he was at that moment in his life. Perhaps he wasn't ready for the kind of commitment I wanted, or maybe he wasn't capable of giving it. But that didn't diminish the love I had for him or the lessons I learned through our time together. Every experience, even the painful ones, shaped me into the person I am today. Now, when I see couples around me embarking on their own journeys toward marriage, I feel a quiet joy rather than envy or sadness. I celebrate their milestones because I understand how precious and rare true commitment is. And I am grateful for the journey I took because it led me to a place where I am loved deeply and fully by someone who matches my heart and my vision. In the end, walking away wasn't about giving up on love, it was about making room for the right love to enter. It was about honoring myself enough to wait for a love that didn't just live in promises but thrived in reality. And that love, when it finally arrived, was more beautiful than I had ever dared to imagine. After the dust of heartbreak settled and the sharp edges of grief softened, I noticed something remarkable. I had more space. Space in my mind, in my heart, in my days. It was as if my life had been tightly colder on someone else's potential decisions for so long. I hadn't realized how much of myself I'd put on hold, how much energy I had spent waiting, adjusting, hoping, dimming. With that space came possibility. One of the first areas that began to shift was my career. I had always been somewhat cautious professionally, often choosing stability over ambition, telling myself I'd wait and see where we would move, what he would want, what our timeline would look like. Looking back, I realize how many of my decisions were influenced by an imagined future that was never guaranteed. I said no to opportunities because they didn't fit with what I thought our next step might be. I hesitated to grow because I didn't want to outpace him or complicate the relationship dynamic. But now, with no one else's plans to accommodate but my own, I began to lean into ambition in a way I never had before. I took risks. I applied for jobs in new cities, explored creative projects I had shelved for years, and said yes to challenges that scared me. I found that I wasn't afraid of failure. I had already survived something deeply painful and come out stronger. That resilience became a quiet source of power that I carried into boardrooms, client meetings, interviews, and long nights building something meaningful. Success didn't happen overnight. But every small win felt amplified by the fact that I had chosen this path for myself. I wasn't climbing towards someone else's dream, I was crafting my own. There was something sacred about that. Independence. I realized that my career wasn't just a way to pay the bills, it was a reflection of my worth, my creativity, and my drive. And in that realization, I began to thrive. Friendships, too, deepened in unexpected ways. During those long years of waiting, I had unconsciously drifted away from some of the people who had once grounded me. Not out of neglect, but because I had invested so heavily in my relationship that other connections began to fade. Walking away reminded me how vital those friendships were, how healing it was to be seen and supported by people who knew me outside of the context of romance. My closest friends were the ones who had sat with me through the silence, who had gently nudged me to question the patterns I was stuck in. They never told me what to do, but they held space for my pain without judgment. Rebuilding those friendships wasn't difficult. The love was still there, waiting patiently for me to return. And as I reconnected with them, I found parts of myself that I had forgotten: my humor, my spontaneity, my curiosity. We laughed louder, talked deeper, traveled farther. I said yes to more plans, more late-night talks, more moments that reminded me how beautiful life could be outside of romantic love. My world expanded in every direction. I didn't feel like I was filling a void, I felt like I was finally inhabiting the life I was meant to live. But the most profound shift happened internally. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing love as something I had to earn. I stopped performing worthiness, stopped shrinking myself to be more palatable, more agreeable, more easy to love. I no longer believed that someone's hesitation to commit was a reflection of my shortcomings. I understood now that real love requires both people to be brave. Not perfect, not always ready, but willing. And I would no longer settle for someone who wasn't willing to stand beside me fully. I started living with more intention. I created rituals for myself: early morning walks, solo coffee dates, Sunday evenings spent journaling or reading instead of scrolling through someone else's life. I invested in therapy not because I was broken, but because I wanted to keep growing. I made peace with the past and forgave both him and myself, not for what could have been, but for what simply wasn't. There were moments of loneliness, of course. Nights when I missed the comfort of another person's presence, when I longed for the feeling of being chosen. But those moments didn't consume me the way they used to. I had built a life that was rich and meaningful, even in solitude. I had learned to enjoy my own company, to trust my own judgment, to rest in the quiet knowledge that I was enough. And eventually, love returned, not the desperate kind that claws for validation, but the soft, steady kind that grows without pressure. It didn't sweep me off my feet or blind me with grand gestures. It unfolded gently, patiently, like a hand reaching out in the dark. He didn't have to convince me with promises of a future. He showed me, day by day, through consistency, honesty, and vulnerability. When he spoke of marriage, it wasn't a vague idea dangled in the distance. It was a conversation rooted in mutual vision, shared timing, and clear intention. There was no guessing, no hoping for change, no analyzing crumbs. It felt simple, not because it lacked depth, but because it was aligned. And when he did propose, I didn't feel relief. I felt joy, not because I had finally been chosen, but because I had chosen myself long before he ever asked. Now, I often look back not with sadness, but with quiet gratitude. Not for the pain I endured, but for what it taught me. I learned to walk away not just from a man, but from a version of myself that believed love had to be earned through waiting. I became someone who no longer fears solitude, who knows the difference between longing and settling, who understands that peace is more valuable than potential, and most importantly, I learned that walking away wasn't about giving up on him. It was about returning to me.